This is Tales and Whispers, where every story is felt, not just heard.
Let's dive into one of the wildest what-if stories in tech history. We're talking about a man who was right there at the very start of Apple, but walked away from a fortune that is almost impossible to imagine. This is the incredible story of Ron Wayne and his $800 decision. Seriously, just take a second to think about that. You're there on day one. You help build the foundation of a company that will literally change the world and become worth trillions. But after just 12 days, you sell your entire 10% stake for what you'd pay for a decent TV.
Yep, $800. That's what Ron Wayne got for his 10% of Apple back in 1976. A slice of the pie that today would be worth, well, hundreds of billions. It's a number that just breaks your brain.
So, that brings us to the real heart of this, the trillion-dollar question. Why? Why on earth would anyone make a choice that, looking back, seems like the single biggest financial fumble in history? The answer, it turns out, is a lot more complicated and a lot more human than you might think. Okay, so let's set the scene. The date is April Fool's Day, 1976. You've got three guys in California getting together to form a little partnership. Their big idea? To build and sell personal computers. And that company, of course, was Apple. Now, when you think of Apple's founders, two names immediately pop into your head, right? Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. But there was a third man in that room, the one who's often called Apple's forgotten founder, Ron Wayne. And this is where the whole dynamic gets super interesting. You had Jobs and Wozniak, both in their early 20s. Absolute geniuses, full of passion, but impulsive kids. Then you have Ron Wayne. He was 41. He was brought in to be the adult in the room, the voice of reason and experience to balance out the two Steves.
And his role wasn't small, not at all. He held a 10% stake, so he could be the tiebreaker if Jobs and Wozniak disagreed. But he did so much more. He literally wrote the first partnership agreement, the document that made Apple an actual company. He drew the very first Apple logo. That super intricate drawing of Isaac Newton under a tree? That was him. He even wrote the manual for their first computer, the Apple I. He was laying the company's very first bricks.
But here's the thing. While he was building that foundation, another feeling was building inside of him, and that was fear. And to really get why, you have to understand a little bit of boring but absolutely critical legal stuff about how they were set up. See, in those first days, Apple wasn't a corporation. It was just a simple partnership. Now that matters because in a partnership, if the company racks up debt and can't pay, creditors can come after the partner's personal assets. We're talking their houses, their cars, their life savings. And of the three of them, Ron Wayne was the only one who really had any personal assets to lose.
And this wasn't just some abstract risk for him. Oh no, this was personal. Just 5 years before Apple, Wayne had started his own business, and it had failed. Badly. It left him in debt, and it took him a long time to dig himself out. He knew firsthand what it felt like when a business dream turns into a financial nightmare. Those scars were still fresh.
So try to see it from his perspective. He's watching this young, fiery Steve Jobs making huge promises, taking out loans to buy parts, basically spending money the company doesn't have yet. For Jobs, this was building a revolution. For Wayne, it looked like a terrifying replay of his biggest failure. He was stuck between two kids who were sure they were going to change the world, and his own hard-earned, fragile financial stability. In that feeling, that conflict, it pushed him right towards the exit. Let's just look at how fast this all fell apart and the financial consequences that came next. This is what's truly mind-blowing. The whole thing lasted just 12 days. Apple is founded on April 1st. For the next week and a half, that fear and doubt just festered until on April 12th, he walked into the registrar's office and had his name legally taken off the contract. He sold his 10% share back to Jobs and Wozniak for $800. And the story doesn't even end there. A couple years later, when Apple was becoming a real corporation, they paid him another $1,500 just to sign a piece of paper saying he'd never make any future claims on the company, just to lock the door for good. The irony here is just painful. That original partnership agreement he wrote himself, the very document that gave him so much anxiety, it sold at an auction in 2011 for $1.6 million. The piece of paper was worth thousands of times more than he ever got from the actual company. And then, there's the big one, the number that makes everyone's jaw drop. That 10% stake he sold for $800 would now be worth hundreds upon hundreds of billions of dollars. By any financial metric you can find, it was a catastrophic decision. But was it a catastrophic decision for the man who actually had to live with it?
This is where the whole story takes a fascinating turn. Because when you hear Ron Wayne talk about it himself, you get a completely different take. His story isn't about regret. It's about having a totally different definition of what it means to be wealthy.
He's been asked this question 1,000 times, and his answer never changes. He's famously said that if he'd stayed, he would have wound up the richest man in the cemetery. For him, the constant stress, the fear of losing everything again, that was a price he just wasn't willing to pay, no matter how big the potential paycheck was. Peace of mind was worth more than money.
So here's the key takeaway. He made the best decision he could with the information, the experience, and this is the important part, the emotional scars he had at that moment. He picked the path that guaranteed him something that money can't buy, a life free from the constant fear that had haunted him before. He chose to sleep at night.
So what's the real lesson here for us? It's not just never sell your Apple stock early. It's way deeper. First, understand the risks, not just on paper, but for you, personally. Second, ask that really tough question. If this all goes to zero, will I be okay? Ron Wayne had lived through that, and his honest answer was no. And finally, you have to make your decision based on that truth, not on somebody else's hype or your own fear of missing out.
And that kind of leaves us with one final thought. When we're at a crossroads, making some huge decision, we've got to ask ourselves, is this choice really mine, based on what I truly value and what I can handle? Or am I just letting myself be pushed around by the ghost of an old failure or pulled along by the hype of a future that's not guaranteed? Answering that question honestly, well, that might be worth more than any number you could ever put on a spreadsheet.